So let's first of all talk about the obvious, what a sensor is. A sensor is what captures the light. It's what gives you your image.
Basically, on a digital camera, in place of the film, there is a sensor. And the sensor is a thing that captures the light and uses that to generate the photo.
Sensor sizes come in many options these days, and usually the smaller sensors are found in cheaper cameras, with the larger types being available in more expensive shooters. Compact cameras as well as mobile phones mostly use sensors which range from 0.15 to about 0.5 centimeters squared in area. The most expensive and professional DSLR cameras have full-frame sensors which have an effective area of 8.6 centimeters squared. There is another rare type of sensor called the medium format sensor. It is found on the most expensive cameras you can find and is not commonly used on a mainstream level. It has an area of 21.59 centimeters squared. If you have two cameras with the same amount of megapixels but different sensor sizes, the one with the larger sensor will usually produce better photos because the individual pixels are much larger on the bigger sensor, also giving you better dynamic range. Here's a diagram showing a few of the most common image sensors found in compact cameras, cell phones, and DSLRs. Please note that the sizes depicted are relative to one another. Underneath, I've also given an example of a device that uses each of the sensors.
And different sensor sizes are exactly that. They're the different size of the sensor that captures the light. And it basically breaks down like this. The bigger the sensor size, the bigger the camera it will need surrounding it. So here we have a full frame sensor size, and a full frame sensor is based on the old 35mm negatives. So what that means is the size of this sensor on its longest edge is 35mm.
Now there are different sizes of sensors. If you look inside a mobile phone, there's a tiny little sensor. And then as you get up through bigger cameras, you know, kind of compact cameras and sort of travel cameras, the sensor sizes vary all the way up until you get to the kind of the 35mm, which is the equivalent of the 35mm film from way back in the day. And that is the kind of the full frame sensor. So here is a quick chart to show you the difference between micro four thirds, APS-C and full frame. And as you can see, full frame is the biggest, and then APS-C is next, and micro four thirds after that. So there is a big area difference between, let's say, a full frame and a micro four thirds. An area, of course, means more space for pixels and for light to be captured by those pixels.
Now what I've got here is two kind of jam jars, and they're going to represent single pixels. And I want you to think of them as vessels for collecting light, because that's exactly what a pixel is. It simply collects photons of light. So this one represents a pixel on a full frame camera, and this one represents a pixel on a smaller sensor camera. And as you can see, the openings at the top are very different. This is quite big, this is quite small. And what we're going to do is we're going to sprinkle some light onto these pixels and see how much they collect. Now, because we can't do it with light in this experiment, we can use water instead, but just imagine it's light. Okay, so I'll give it a few seconds. Right, ideal. So let's have a look. So as you can see, there's definitely more water or more light in the bigger jar than in the smaller jar, because it has a bigger opening.
Blue one on the bottom right, that's the size that you would see in most cell phones, including most iPhones. If we go up to the next box, we see the sensor that you would see in a lot of compact cameras and super zoom type cameras and underwater all-weather cameras. We see a lot of different sensor sizes, and these are going to be found in enthusiast cameras. These are large sensors. So we start out with the micro four thirds, which is the yellow one on the bottom of the little red box, and then we move into the APS-C family sensors, which is what you're going to see in the vast majority of DSLRs, all the way up to the dark orange one in the upper left corner. That's a full frame sensor.
Now, sensor sizes range dramatically between compacts, which this little Panasonic TZ70 is 6.17mm by 4.55, with this medium format, Pentax 645Z, being 43.8 by 32.8mm. So the difference there is massive, and the difference is in what they can produce as well. This is a high-end, fashion shoot, model quality, studio quality camera. It can shoot megapixels. I think this one's 51.4 megapixels, so it can be blown up massive. You can use this for billboard. The quality is amazing. Each pixel is big, so it takes in a lot of light, and the narrow depth of field you can create is amazing. You can shoot someone's eye and have the eyelash in focus and the eye completely out of focus. So that can create incredible quality. The TZ70 has great images. There's no doubting that. Where you'll struggle is any low light situation. You'll get grain. If you push the ISO up, you'll get noise and grain, and you won't be able to create that nice narrow depth of field. Most photographers and enthusiasts will sit in the middle of those two. And this is where we have a smaller range, or a smaller notch up each time, of sensor sizes. So we've got your high-end compacts, micro four thirds, APS-C size, and full frame.
Crop factor is a very, very basic formula for understanding how the field of view that you get through a given lens will change depending on which camera you have it attached to. For any given camera system, you've probably got dozens of lenses to choose from, and the primary difference between those lenses is the focal length. So now focal length, it's a measurement of some internal bits of the lens. It's not super important exactly what focal length measures. What is important to understand is that focal length determines the field of view, the angle of view that you're going to get with your lens. Let's go back a couple of decades. Before digital cameras were the standard, 35mm film was the standard, okay? And if you took, if you were, let's say, a Canon shooter back in those days, and you used different lenses, you might find that you really like the field of view that you get with a 50mm lens, right? That's a pretty standard lens. Most photographers had a 50mm lens in their backpack. What's cool is that if you were to jump to a Nikon camera system or a Leica camera system, they all use the same film size. So if you want to get that same angle of view, you know to get a 50mm lens. If I want a more telephoto field of view, right, a narrower field of view that kind of brings the image closer to me, you get a longer focal length, let's say a 100mm lens. You put a 100mm lens on the Canon system, you're going to get that telephoto field of view. And the same applies for the Nikon and the Leica camera systems, right? The old film camera systems. If you want that same 100mm field of view from the Canon, you just get a 100mm lens because they all have the same film size. So now if I take that same 50mm film lens and I put that onto a crop camera, like my Micro Four Thirds, right? They're crop sensors. If I take that same lens, put it on that camera system, it's actually going to give me a totally different field of view. What I used to know as the 50mm field of view is now totally different because I'm using a camera system with a different size sensor. The reason behind this is that the field of view that you get into your camera is a combination of mathematics and geometry and stuff that includes the focal length of your lens and the size of your image sensor. No photographers out there are doing the math to try and figure out exactly what lens they want to get a given field of view. They just kind of instinctively know this from experience. And a lot of people have experience with the old 35mm film cameras. And so that's why crop factor is such a commonly used tool. You know, people had a lot of experience using lenses on the old film cameras, right? They're used to understanding exactly what kind of angle of view they're going to get with the 50mm lens. And they want to understand how that's going to change as they move to a crop body camera, like a Micro Four Thirds or a Fujifilm mirrorless camera. No matter which camera system I put this 50mm lens onto, this lens is gathering the same amount of light, right? This lens is seeing the exact same thing, and it's projecting the same image inside of the camera. The only difference is that the image sensor inside the camera that the lens is projecting the image onto, that image sensor is different sizes depending on which camera you get. And so this is where the term crop factor comes into play, is that you have this projecting an image, let's say this size. It's not that big, but let's say it's projecting an image this size for your old film camera. The Micro Four Thirds sensor is actually only this size. And so it's basically cropping out some of the image, right? And that's where the term crop factor comes from.
So what I've got here is a APS-C and a 35mm sensor size drawn here, and around it is the projection circle that comes out of the back of the lens. So the APS-C lenses will create a circle this size, and the 35mm full frame lenses will create a projection circle as big as this one here. So looking at it from the side, you can see that we've got green as the full frame and orange as the APS-C. This is my awesome Sony camera body, as you guys can see. So what the focal length of a lens actually is a dimension from the sensor plane to the convergence point where all the light crosses and flips upside down. Basically what that looks like is if you took, I drew this all in inches so it's a little bit easier to work with the scale, but so we got 50mm out from the sensor plane, and if we draw a line from the very edge of the projection circle to the convergence point, that needs to be 50mm. And when we draw this line, which I've already drawn here, it crosses at the convergence point, projects to the 35mm circle size, and comes out the front of the lens. This would be a 50mm lens. So the field of view you would get with a full frame lens on a full frame sensor would be this dimension here when it's all said and done. But if you were to use the exact same lens, a full frame lens again, on a APS-C sensor size, you would only be utilizing this much of the projection here. So it would look as if you were only using this much. So if we take that dimension there, that's 41 inches and 62 inches, which those don't mean anything, it's just a comparison. The smaller one is exactly 66% of the size, which is the 1.5 crop factor of the APS-C lens. So the exact same lens on different size sensors gives you a different field of view. And the smaller field of view is your crop factor, which would be 75mm in this case.
We're just going to take a shot of these beach huts. So here we go. Okay, that's the first shot taken. Full frame camera, 35mm focal length. Okay, now I've got the crop sensor camera on there. It's a Canon 1200D for people who want to know. And I'm going to now take the same picture. The tripod hasn't moved, nothing's moved. I'm going to take the same picture at the same focal length of 35mm. So here we go. Okay, so that is now the same picture with a crop sensor camera at the same focal length. Nothing's moved, and what you can see is that it's a cropped in version of the full frame camera one. Now what I'm going to do is zoom out so that I can get the equivalent look of what I did with the full frame camera. Now for this you have to zoom out to 22mm of focal length. So at 35mm on a full frame is the equivalent of 22mm on a crop sensor camera. So now I'm just going to zoom out, take the same shot again so that you can see that they're the same picture. And there you go. So now if we compare that shot with the first shot that I took on the full frame camera, they're the same, but the focal length is different on each camera. And that's what the crop sensor is doing. It's quite simply cropping in your image, so all you need to do is zoom out a bit to get the equivalent look.
So for example, a Micro Four Thirds system has a 2x crop compared to a full frame. So what that means, if you took a full frame picture at a particular focal length, let's say at 18 millimeters, then the picture that you would capture at 18 millimeters on a Micro Four Thirds would be reduced by a factor of 2. Now to get around this, of course, because people don't just want to take small pictures, we want to be able to take landscapes, we want to be able to take portraits, you get different lenses that attach to different systems. So for example, a kit lens on a typical Micro Four Thirds system might run from, let's say, 12 millimeters up to 32 millimeters. Whereas the kit lens on a standard full frame system might run from, say, 24 millimeters up to 70 millimeters. Now, because the Micro Four Thirds is a 2 times crop, actually if you double the focal length, you'll see that they're talking about the same range. So it's 12 millimeters on Micro Four Thirds and 24 millimeters on full frame. Well, 2 times 12 is 24. And at the other end, on my Lumix Micro Four Thirds camera that I have, it goes up to 32, which doubled is 64, and the kit lens on a full frame might be 24 to 70. So you can see 64 and 70 are very, very close. So it kind of gives you that same optical range, and the same kind of photos from landscapes to portraits can be captured.
The first thing you need to understand is that the true focal length of a lens never changes. A 50mm lens might look different on different camera systems, but it is always a 50mm lens. So regardless of which size sensor it's designed for, a 50mm lens is always a 50mm lens. Every lens projects an image onto a sensor. That's the basic job of the lens. All that's changing when lenses are designed for different sensors is how big that image that they're projecting is. So, as that image circle shrinks to cover smaller sensors, the image is simply being cropped down. So, on the left here we have sensor sizes. Full frame, then Super 35, and then Micro Four Thirds. And on the right, we have a 50mm lens projecting an image. It can project all of that image to cover the full frame sensor, or a smaller section of the image to cover a smaller sensor. So all you have to do is make sure that your lens is covering the size of your sensor. If you put a Micro Four Thirds lens on a Super 35mm camera, you'll have a huge black vignette. But with a full frame lens, you'll get exactly the same results as you would have with a lens which is designed for Super 35mm, because all the rest of the image is just being thrown away. Full frame is used as the standard size, then APS-C or Super 35mm is roughly a 1.6 times crop. Then Micro Four Thirds is about a 2 times crop. When you put two shots from different sized sensors, but with the same lens next to one another, it will be as if the smaller sensor was using a longer focal length. We call this the equivalent focal length. To find out what they will look like, you times the focal length of the lens by the crop factor. So a 50mm on a full frame shows a 50mm image. On a Super 35mm, it's around 80mm. And on Micro Four Thirds, it's around 100mm.
Let me explain. Now the big difference can be seen when you start to take photos in low light. So if you are a wedding photographer, for example, or you like to take photos inside of, let's say, a museum where you're inside of a building, maybe there's not that much natural light, then a bigger sensor is going to be better.
So if you look at the very large sensor, some of the things that I've already told you, it has bigger photo sites, which means it will have superior low light performance, which means you can really push that sensor at high ISOs and get an acceptable picture. It has better dynamic range. The camera bodies are going to be significantly bigger. And even more importantly, because you have to cover that big sensor with light, the lenses are going to be much, much bigger, even with new technology, and they're going to be much, much more expensive. First of all, it's much less expensive to make these sensors and to buy them, which means that the cameras are going to be less expensive to manufacture and they are going to be cheaper to buy. The lenses, because they have to cover a smaller area because that sensor is smaller, will also be a lot less expensive to buy and to make. Because the sensors are smaller and the lenses are smaller, the camera bodies can be smaller, which makes them easier to travel with. Smaller photo sites, which means that you have poorer low light performance. You're going to pick up a lot more of the noise that the chip actually makes in low light, so you'll have a much grainier, crummier picture. You'll have poorer dynamic range, although it still looks quite fine in most instances, but especially in bad light conditions, you're not going to have as good dynamic range, and you'll have, because your focal length of the lenses are going to be physically much smaller, less ability to blur the background.
So the advantages of larger sensors are better depth of field performance, better low light performance, better dynamic range, and less diffraction. The disadvantages are cameras with large sensors are very expensive. Cameras with larger sensors are also generally big in size and heavy. And finally, equipment that is used with such cameras is generally expensive. In terms of film and video, the sensor size phenomenon reaches a gray area of diminishing returns in that there's not too much a larger sensor necessarily gives you, especially when you consider pricing of larger sensor video cameras. Sensor size doesn't make a huge difference in video unless you're going for extremely shallow or extremely deep depth of field and shooting a lot of low light footage, since you can basically compensate for everything else by picking the right focal length and aperture. So